I'm Kara Sterling, 27, and I've built a six-figure reputation as the best forensic restoration specialist in the state, though my family thinks I just mop floors. My mother's house always smells like expensive lilies and artificial grace, a stark contrast to the metallic scent of iron and industrial-grade disinfectants that usually clings to my skin. I stood in the dining room, smoothing the white linen tablecloth, my fingers catching on the fine fabric. My palms are rough, mapped with the calluses of a woman who handles high-pressure hoses and heavy machinery, a detail that seems to offend my mother's very existence. Kara, dear, try not to leave smudges on the silverware, my mother said without looking up from her seating chart. She adjusted her pearls, her eyes hovering over the guest list like a general preparing for war. I know you're used to, well, a different standard of cleanliness in your little trade, but this is your sister's rehearsal dinner. It needs to be perfect, not janitor perfect, actually perfect. The word janitor hung in the air heavy and insulting. I felt the familiar heat rise in my neck, a slow burn that started at my collarbone and worked its way up to my cheeks. I reached for the heavy silver forks, placing them with the same surgical precision I use when I'm decontaminating a crime scene. I don't just clean, I restore life to places where tragedy has struck. I handle the things people are too terrified to look at, yet here, in this house of mirrors and high society pretension, I was nothing more than a girl with a bucket. I'm finding myself, Mom, I said, my voice tight and controlled. I was repeating the lie she told her friends at the country club. Is that what we're calling it today? My mother sighed, a long, dramatic sound that signaled her deep disappointment. She finally looked at me, her eyes lingering on the faint scar on my forearm, a souvenir from a jagged piece of glass at a biohazard site. I just tell the guests you're exploring the service industry. It sounds more deliberate, less like you failed out of the life we planned for you. Before I could respond, the double doors swung open. Bianca swept into the room, a whirlwind of white silk and expensive perfume. She looked like a vision of bridal perfection, her blonde hair coiffed into a style that probably cost more than my first industrial vacuum. She didn't walk, she glided. And on her left hand, a 5-carat diamond caught the light from the crystal chandelier, sending blinding, jagged sparks across the walls. It was a trophy, a sign that she had successfully completed the mission my mother had failed to recruit me for, marrying into the old money of the Sterling vein circle. Oh, Kara, Bianca chirped, her voice dripping with a sweetness that felt like acid. She didn't hug me, she never hugged me anymore. She was afraid the stink of my labor might ruin her designer wardrobe. Still at it, you really have a knack for the domestic arts, don't you? It's so quaint. She held her hand up, admiring the rock on her finger. It was obscene, a mountain of pressurized carbon that symbolized everything I had walked away from. Actually, she leaned in, her eyes glinting with a cruel, feline playfulness. Since you're so good with a sponge and those industrial chemicals you use, do you think you could polish this for me? I'm sure you have some work rags in your car that could really make it pop. Or does your equipment only work on grease and grime? The air in the room felt thick, like I was standing in a room with no ventilation. I gripped the edge of the mahogany table until my knuckles turned white, the bone nearly breaking through the skin. I could feel the eyes of the two early guests already seated in the parlor, family friends who lived for this kind of subtle bloodletting, burning into my back. They were listening. They were waiting for me to snap. My work rags are for professional use only, Bianca, I said, my pulse thrumming in my fingertips. I don't think you could handle the chemicals I use. They tend to strip away everything that isn't real. Bianca's smile didn't falter, but her eyes narrowed. Always so dramatic. It's just a cleaning job, Kara. Don't try to make it sound like you're saving the world. You scrub floors, you're the help with a last name. Bianca, don't tease her, my mother interrupted, though there was no real reprimand in her tone. She's sensitive about her choices. We all have our little rebellions. Some people buy a motorcycle. Kara bought a mop. They laughed. It was a light, tinkling sound that filled the room, mocking the years of hard work I had put into building my company. They had no idea I had cleared 6 figures last year. They had no idea that I owned 3 specialized vans and a warehouse. To them, I was the girl who came home with dirt under her fingernails. The sting of their public shame was a familiar, cold companion. I looked down at the table, at the perfect arrangement of silver and crystal, and I felt a simmering fire in my chest. They wanted to treat me like the help. They wanted to mock the very skills that allowed me to look at the world's darkest corners without flinching. Just finish the settings, my mother commanded, turning her back to me to adjust a floral arrangement. And for heaven's sake, Kara, go wash your hands again. I can practically smell the bleach from here. It's unrefined. I looked at my hands. They were clean, cleaner than any of the souls in this room. I looked at Bianca, who was busy admiring her reflection in a silver serving tray. She had no idea that the groom she was so proud of had called my professional line 2 weeks ago, frantic and sobbing, needing a discreet cleanup that he couldn't explain to his bride. I took a deep breath, the scent of lilies suddenly feeling suffocating. I wouldn't say anything yet. I would let them have their dinner. I would let them have their jokes. But as I placed the final glass on the table, I knew that the altar wouldn't just be the place where my sister got married. It would be the place where I finally stopped playing the role of the disgraced daughter and showed them exactly what happens when you try to sweep the truth under the rug. My silence wasn't a submission, it was a countdown. I'm Zelda Vance, 29, and I own a premier forensic restoration firm that handles the biohazardous aftermath of tragedies most people only see in nightmares. My back felt like it was being stitched together with rusted wire. I had just finished a 12-hour rotation at a triple homicide site across the state line. My boots were still in the trunk of my car, sealed in airtight bags to contain the scent of iron and industrial-grade decontaminants. My muscles were screaming for a hot bath and a dark room. Instead, I was standing in the cavernous, echoing kitchen of the Vance estate, surrounded by the suffocating scent of white lilies and high society panic. My father, Arthur, walked toward me. He wasn't carrying a glass of wine or a word of welcome. He was lugging a battered yellow mop bucket and a wooden-handled mop that looked like it belonged in a 1950s asylum. He dropped the bucket at my feet with a heavy, wet thud. Water splashed onto my shins, cold and mocking. The professional venue cleaners quoted $5,000 for a deep scrub of the ballroom and the foyer, he said, checking his gold watch as if my time had no value. It's an extortionate rate. Since you're already in the business, I told your mother we could save the overhead. You'll handle the heavy lifting for the reception hall. I stared at the mop. I thought about the 3 specialized vans I owned. I thought about the 20 employees who took orders from me. I thought about the high-pressure steam extractors and the chemical neutralizers I used to erase the evidence of death itself. I just worked a double shift, Dad, I said, my voice sounding like it was scraping against sandpaper. I'm exhausted. Hire the crew. Don't be difficult, Zelda, he snapped, his face reddening. We've spent a fortune on Bianca's dress and the catering. This is the least you can do for the family. Besides, it's not like this is real work for you. It's just what you do every day, isn't it? Pushing a bucket. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and disdain. To him, I wasn't a business owner. I was a janitor who had failed to marry well. He didn't see the grit under my nails as a sign of hard-earned success. He saw it as a stain on the Vance name. I looked out toward the ballroom. The marble floors stretched out like a frozen lake, thousands of square feet of cold, unforgiving stone. My spine throbbed in protest. I could feel the phantom weight of my heavy-duty respirator pressing against my face. The marble needs a pH-neutral cleaner, Dad, I said, my voice low. If you use whatever is in that bucket, you'll strip the sealant. Just scrub the floor, Zelda, he sighed, turning his back on me. Stop trying to make it sound like rocket science. It's soap and water. I grabbed the mop. The wood was rough and splintered against my palms. I began to push the water across the marble, the rhythmic slosh drag echoing through the empty house. Every movement was an agony. My hamstrings felt like they were going to snap. I was a woman who restored dignity to crime scenes, yet here I was being stripped of my own in the house I grew up in. The grand double doors to the foyer swung open. Liam, Bianca's fiancé, walked in. He was still in his charcoal gray suit, looking every bit the golden boy of the Sterling Vane Empire. He stopped dead when he saw me. His eyes dropped to the bucket, then up to my face, which was pale and shadowed with fatigue. A look of pure, unadulterated horror washed over him. He knew. He was the only one in this entire family who actually knew what I did for a living. 2 weeks ago, he had called me in a blind panic. He had been at a bachelor party that went sideways in a rented penthouse. No one died, but the property damage was a biohazard nightmare that would have ended his reputation and his engagement if the news got out. I had personally handled the cleanup. I had seen him shaking in the corner while I bleached away the evidence of his mistakes. Zelda, he whispered, his voice cracking. What are you doing? I didn't stop. I pushed the mop forward, the dirty water swirling over the pristine white stone. I'm the help today, Liam, didn't you hear? The professionals were too expensive. He moved toward me, his hand reaching out to take the mop handle. Give me that, you shouldn't be doing this. You're a professional, I saw you work, you shouldn't be. Liam, there you are. My mother swept into the room, her silk heels clicking sharply against the wet marble. She didn't even glance at the puddle she was walking through. She moved between Liam and me, her hand landing firmly on his forearm, pushing him back. Don't get too close, dear, she said, her voice a high, artificial chime. She's covered in those dreadful chemicals she uses. You'll ruin your suit. Eleanor, she's exhausted, Liam said, his eyes still locked on mine. He looked guilty. He looked sick. She shouldn't be cleaning the floors for her own sister's wedding. It's not right. My mother laughed, a sharp, cold sound that echoed off the high ceilings. She looked at me, her eyes raking over my tired frame with an expression of intense satisfaction. Nonsense, my mother said, patting Liam's hand. Zelda needs the practice. If she's insisted on making a career out of being a maid, she might as well be a useful one for once. It's good for her to remember her place before the guests arrive tomorrow. We wouldn't want her getting ideas that she's one of us. I looked at the mop. I looked at the bucket. Then I looked at Liam. He looked away, unable to meet my gaze. He knew the truth, but he was too much of a coward to speak it. I felt a cold, sharp clarity settle over me. The pain in my back didn't go away, but it became a secondary concern. I realized then that they didn't just want the floor clean. They wanted to see me on my knees. I'll finish the ballroom, Mother, I said, my voice steady and devoid of emotion. See, she said to Liam, leading him away toward the parlor. She's perfectly fine. Some people are just born for the labor, Liam. It's in their nature. I watched them leave. I stood alone in the center of the vast, cold room, the mop in my hand like a pathetic scepter. I looked down at the marble. It was shining now, reflecting the light from the chandeliers above. It was perfect. It was sterile. But as I dipped the mop back into the gray, dirty water, I knew that no amount of scrubbing would ever make this family clean. The altar was waiting, and I was going to make sure that when the truth finally came out, it would leave a stain that no professional, not even me, could ever remove. I'm Zelda Vance, 29, and I own a premier forensic restoration firm that handles the biohazardous aftermath of tragedies most people only see in nightmares. The air in the steakhouse was thick with the scent of charred wagyu and aged red wine. It was a five-star establishment, the kind where the waiters move like ghosts and the silverware costs more than my first car. I sat at the very end of a long, white-clothed table. My chair was positioned directly next to the swinging double doors of the kitchen. Every few seconds, a gust of humid, grease-laden air hit the back of my neck. I could hear the muffled chaos of the line cooks and the sharp clatter of industrial dishwashers. I was the only one at the table without a personalized place card. I was the only one whose water glass remained empty, while the sommelier poured a vintage Bordeaux for everyone else. My hands were tucked beneath the table, hidden in the folds of my navy blue dress. They were red and raw. The skin around my knuckles was peeling from the hours I'd spent scrubbing the ballroom floor with the harsh pH-neutral cleaners I'd brought from my van. My mother had forbidden me from using my professional equipment, forcing me to use that archaic mop. My body was an engine running on fumes. I leaned back and my shoulder brushed against a passing waiter. He didn't apologize. He looked at me with the same dismissive neutrality he'd give a coat rack. To this room of socialites and legacy wealth, I was a ghost. I was the unfortunate sister. Across the room, at the head table, Bianca was glowing. Her diamond engagement ring caught the light of the crystal chandeliers, throwing tiny, jagged rainbows across the walls. She looked like a princess in a fairy tale that I had been edited out of. To her right sat Liam. He looked stiff in his tuxedo. His collar seemed too tight. He wasn't eating. He was staring at his plate as if the steak were a crime scene he was trying to decipher. Suddenly, the sharp clink, clink, clink of silver against glass cut through the low hum of conversation. Bianca stood up. She held a crystal flute of champagne in one hand and a silver dessert spoon in the other. A hush fell over the room. My mother leaned forward, a proud, expectant smile plastered onto her face. My father crossed his arms, nodding encouragingly at his favorite daughter. "Everyone, if I could have your attention for just a moment," Bianca said, her voice tinkling like a wind chime. "I wanted to share a little story. A family story." I felt a cold prickle of dread crawl up my spine. My stomach did a slow, nauseous roll. "We all know that weddings can be stressful," Bianca continued, her eyes scanning the room until they landed on me. Her smile widened. It was the smile of a predator that had finally cornered its prey. "And we all know my sister Zelda has always been industrious. She has her little cleaning business after all." A few titters of laughter rippled through the guests. I felt my face flush a deep, burning crimson. I stared at the centerpiece in front of me, a cluster of white roses that smelled like funeral arrangements. A few years ago, when Zelda was first starting out, I asked her to help me get my apartment ready for a dinner party, Bianca said, her tone mock confidential. "I thought I'd give her some practice. Well, I went into the bathroom to check her work and I found a spot. Just one tiny, microscopic smudge on the marble tile." She paused for dramatic effect. The room was silent now, hanging on her every word. I pointed it out to her, Bianca whispered into the microphone, and Zelda didn't just clean it. She slumped against the wall and started to sob. She cried over a smudge on a bathroom floor. I realized then that some people just aren't built for the pressure of high standards. She was so overwhelmed by a single tile. The room erupted. The socialites howled with laughter. A woman at the table next to me leaned over to her husband and whispered, "Can you imagine crying over a floor?" I sat frozen. The lie was so effortless it was almost beautiful. I remembered that day. I hadn't been crying over a smudge. I had been crying because I'd just come from my first solo contract, a scene where a lonely elderly man had been dead for 3 weeks before anyone noticed. I had spent 10 hours breathing through a respirator, scrubbing the physical remnants of a forgotten life off a linoleum floor. I had come to Bianca's because she told me she was sick and needed help. I was exhausted, traumatized, and physically depleted, and she had mocked me for missing a water spot. I felt myself shrinking. I felt the heat from the kitchen doors behind me intensified. I could smell it now. The faint, lingering scent of bleach and industrial-grade enzymes on my own skin. It was under my fingernails. It was in my pores. No matter how much expensive perfume I sprayed on myself, I smelled like death and the chemicals used to erase it. I looked up, my eyes stinging. I expected to see Liam laughing with the rest of them. Instead, I found him staring directly at me. He wasn't laughing. He wasn't even smiling. His face was pale, his jaw set so tight I thought his teeth might crack. He was looking at me with an expression that made the air in my lungs vanish. It wasn't pity. Pity is soft. Pity is what you feel for a wounded bird. This was something much sharper. It was a look of profound, terrifying recognition. He was looking at the woman who had walked into a blood-spattered penthouse 2 weeks ago and didn't blink. He was looking at the woman who had held his shaking hands and told him he wouldn't go to prison as long as he stayed quiet and let her work. He looked at Bianca, then back at me. In his eyes, I saw a flicker of something that looked like a warning. He knew that the woman Bianca was mocking didn't exist. He knew that the maid at the end of the table held his entire future in her scarred, chemical-burned hands. I didn't look away. I let the laughter wash over me like dirty water. I let the smell of the kitchen grease fill my nose. I gripped the edge of the table until my knuckles turned white. Bianca raised her glass. "To being perfect," she toasted, her eyes sparkling with malice. "To being perfect," the room echoed. I didn't lift my glass, I just watched Liam. I saw the way he gripped his own wine glass so hard the stem looked ready to snap. The countdown in my head wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a roar. Tomorrow, at the altar, I wasn't going to be the girl who cried over a smudge. I was going to be the woman who revealed the filth hiding beneath the Vance family's polished surface. And I knew, looking at Liam's terrified face, that he was the first one who realized the floor was about to fall out from under them all. I'm Zelda Vance, 29, and I own a premier forensic restoration firm that handles the biohazardous aftermath of tragedies most people only see in nightmares. The vibration of my phone against the nightstand felt like a localized earthquake. 4:02 a.m. I didn't even have to look at the screen to know it was dispatch. I rolled out of bed, my joints screaming after the hours I'd spent on my knees scrubbing the ballroom floor for my mother. My muscles felt like they had been replaced with rusted iron cables. I answered on the second ring. "Vance," I croaked, my voice thick with the little sleep I'd managed to steal. "Zelda, we have a code black at a private estate in the hills." The dispatcher's voice was clipped, urgent. "High profile. The family wants it erased before the sun is fully up. They specifically requested the owner." They've heard you're the only one who can handle a complex scene without a word to the press. I was moving before she finished the sentence. I threw on my charcoal gray work pants and a heavy-duty cotton shirt. I didn't look in the mirror. I didn't want to see the dark circles under my eyes or the way my skin looked sallow in the pre-dawn light. I was a ghost haunting my own life, preparing to go clean up someone else's. 30 minutes later, I was standing in the foyer of a mansion that made my parents' estate look like a guest cottage. The air inside was heavy with the metallic tang of copper and the cloying, sweet scent of expensive lilies. It was a contradiction I lived with every day. Wealth doesn't protect you from the visceral reality of biology. I stepped into my Tyvek suit. The crinkle of the white plastic was the only sound in the cavernous room. I pulled the hood over my hair and snapped the seal on my full-face respirator. Hiss, click. The world narrowed down to the rhythmic sound of my own breathing and the circle of light from my headlamp. The room was a disaster. It was a master bedroom, or it had been. Now it was a shattered landscape of broken glass, overturned antique furniture, and the dark, sprawling maps of a life that had ended violently. I didn't ask questions. I never did. My job wasn't to judge, it was to restore. I spent the next 5 hours in a state of hyper-focused trance. I worked with a chemical precision that would have terrified my mother. I used enzyme digesters to break down the organic matter. I used HEPA vacuums to swallow the tiny shards of a broken crystal carafe. I scrubbed the silk wallpaper with a specialized solvent, my movements rhythmic and punishing. Sweat pooled inside my suit. It stung my eyes and itched against my collarbone. My lungs burned with the filtered air. But as I worked, I felt a strange, cold peace. In this shattered room, I was the one in control. I was the one who could turn chaos back into order. I was the one who could make the ugly things vanish. By 9:30 a.m., the room was sterile. It was a blank slate smelling of nothing but ozone and industrial-grade cleanliness. I stripped off my gear in the driveway, the cool morning air hitting my damp skin like a slap. I was vibrating with exhaustion and adrenaline. I had 2.5 hours until the wedding began. I drove home like a woman with a death wish. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, uneven beat. I arrived at the estate and slipped through the servants' entrance, avoiding the caterers and the florists who were swarming the grounds like ants on a sugar cube. I reached my bedroom and locked the door. I needed 20 minutes. Just 20 minutes to wash the smell of death and bleach off my skin before I had to put on that ridiculous periwinkle bridesmaid dress and pretend I wasn't the unfortunate sister. I walked toward my closet, my hand reaching for the garment bag. It wasn't there. I froze. I looked around the room. My eyes landed on the plastic trash can in the corner. Something blue was spilling over the rim. I walked over, my legs feeling like lead. I reached down and pulled it out. It was the dress. Or what was left of it. The delicate silk had been systematically shredded. The bodice was sliced into ribbons. The skirt was hacked into jagged, uneven strips. It looked like it had been through a wood chipper. Pinned to the remains of the left sleeve was a heavy, cream-colored note. I recognized the elegant, looping cursive immediately. It was my mother's handwriting. "Zelda, dear," it read, "I saw you sneaking out this morning. Truly, your dedication to your little hobby is admirable, but you looked so haggard when you returned. I've done you a favor. This dress was always too refined for you. It emphasized your coarse features. You'd look much more at home in your overalls today. Don't worry, I'll tell the guests you had a migraine. It's better if you stay out of the photos anyway. We want the day to be perfect." A hot, white flash of rage blinded me. I gripped the shredded silk until my knuckles popped. The cruelty wasn't just in the act, it was in the casualness of it. She had destroyed my place at the wedding as easily as she'd order a salad. To her, I wasn't a daughter. I was a blemish on her perfect aesthetic. I threw the dress back into the trash. I wasn't going to cry. I didn't have any tears left for these people. I turned to grab my work bag, intending to find my keys and leave this house forever. As I unzipped the side pocket to grab my phone, a small, folded piece of paper fluttered out. It wasn't on my company stationery. It was a piece of lined notebook paper torn at the edges. I unfolded it. "Wait for the speech," it said. That was it. 4 words. The handwriting was Liam's, jagged, hurried, and pressured. I stared at the note. The rage in my chest didn't dissipate, but it shifted. It became something colder, something sharper. A weapon. I looked at my reflection in the vanity mirror. My face was pale. My eyes were bloodshot. I looked like a woman who had spent the night in a hazmat suit scrubbing blood off marble floors. I looked like a woman who had been erased. But I wasn't going to stay in my room, and I wasn't going to wear my overalls. I reached into the back of my closet and pulled out a garment bag I'd hidden months ago. It wasn't periwinkle. It wasn't soft. It was a sleek, black silk jumpsuit I'd bought with my own money, the kind of outfit that said I didn't need their approval because I already owned the room. I looked at Liam's note one more time. Wait for the speech. The countdown wasn't a roar anymore. It was a silent, ticking bomb. I didn't know what Liam was planning, but I knew one thing for certain. My mother wanted a perfect wedding. She wanted a day without a single smudge. She was about to find out that some stains are permanent. And I was the only one who knew how to make them bleed. I'm Zelda Vance, 29, and I own a premier forensic restoration firm that handles the biohazardous aftermath of tragedies most people only see in nightmares. I stared at the black silk jumpsuit hanging on my closet door for exactly 3 seconds. It was elegant. It was expensive. It was exactly what a civilized daughter would wear to her sister's wedding to prove she belonged. I reached out and touched the fabric, then I pulled my hand back as if the silk had burned me. My mother wanted me to stay hidden because I was a blemish. She wanted the world to see a polished, perfect family portrait that didn't include the girl who spent her mornings scrubbing blood out of floorboards. If she wanted a migraine, I was going to give her a stroke. I didn't reach for the silk. I reached for the floor, grabbing my heavy work bag. I pulled out my navy blue utility jumpsuit. The fabric was thick, industrial-grade cotton, still slightly damp with the sweat of a 6-hour cleanup. I stepped into it, zipping it up to my throat. The white embroidered letters across my chest, Sterling Restorations, glimmered under the vanity lights. I didn't wash the soot from my fingernails. I didn't brush the tangles out of my hair, which was still matted from the pressure of the respirator straps. I laced up my steel-toed work boots, pulling the leather laces so tight my fingers went numb. I looked in the mirror. I looked exhausted. I looked filthy. I looked like the woman who actually kept this family's reputation afloat with every secret I buried and every stain I erased. I didn't take my car. I took the company truck, the white Ford F-250 with the yellow strobe lights on the roof. I drove to the Grace Cathedral with the windows down, the wind whipping my hair into a frenzy. I pulled into the circular driveway, ignoring the valet's horrified expression as I jumped out of the cab. My boots hit the gravel with a heavy, crunching thud that sounded like a declaration of war. The ceremony had already started. I could hear the muffled, thunderous roar of the pipe organ through the massive, arched oak doors. I stood in the vestibule for a moment, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. My palms were slick. My throat was dry. I took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of my own work. the faint, lingering sharp tang of hospital-grade disinfectant and the metallic ghost of copper. I didn't knock. I didn't slip in quietly. I grabbed both handles of the double doors and shoved. The doors swung open with a violent creak that cut through the organ's swell like a knife. The music faltered, the organist's hands slipping on the keys as the sudden burst of daylight flooded the dim, candle-lit sanctuary. A wave of cold air rushed past me, carrying the smell of diesel and bleach into the scent of expensive lilies and incense. The silence that followed was physical. It was a heavy, suffocating weight. I didn't stop. I stepped onto the white silk runner that led down the center aisle. Thud, thud, thud. My steel-toed boots left dark, damp imprints on the pristine fabric. I felt the eyes of 500 people lock onto me. I heard the collective intake of breath, a ripple of gasps that moved through the pews like a gust of wind through dry leaves. I saw my mother first. She was sitting in the front row, draped in champagne-colored lace. As I walked, her head turned slowly. I watched the color drain from her face, leaving it a sickly, chalky white before a flush of violent, bruised purple crept up from her neck. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She looked like she was choking on her own tongue. Beside her, my father gripped the armrest of the pew so hard I heard the wood groan. I kept my gaze fixed straight ahead. I didn't look at the socialites in their fascinators or the business tycoons in their custom suits. I looked at the altar. Bianca was standing there, a vision in 300 yards of Italian tulle. She looked like a doll carved from ice. As I got closer, I saw her eyes go wide, her nostrils flaring in disgust. She looked at my navy jumpsuit, at the Sterling Restorations logo, and then at my boots. A small, high-pitched whimper escaped her lips. This was her perfect day. This was her moment of total aesthetic victory. And there I was, the smudge she couldn't wipe away. I reached the front of the church. The air here was thick with the scent of the thousands of white roses that line the altar. The same roses I knew had cost more than my first 2 industrial vans. I stopped just a few feet from the bridal party. I smelled like a crime scene. I looked like a nightmare. I looked at Liam. He was standing next to Bianca, his face a mask of unreadable stillness. He wasn't looking at Bianca. He was looking at me. His eyes weren't filled with the horror I saw on every other face in the room. There was a spark there, a grim, dark recognition. He saw the grime on my face. He saw the exhaustion in my posture. I didn't say a word. I didn't have to. I just stood there, my boots planted firmly on the silk runner, my arms hanging at my sides. I was the ghost at the feast. I was the reality they all tried so hard to pretend didn't exist. My mother finally found her voice. It was a strangled, hissing whisper that carried through the silent church. "Zelda, get out." I didn't move. I felt a drop of sweat roll down my temple, carving a clean line through the dust on my skin. I looked her dead in the eye, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the urge to flinch. "I'm not missing the speeches," I said. My voice wasn't a whisper. It was loud, clear, and raspy from the chemicals. It echoed off the vaulted ceiling, ringing in the ears of every person who had ever laughed at my little hobby. I took a seat in the empty space at the end of the front row, right next to my mother. The fabric of my jumpsuit crinkled loudly in the silence. I crossed my legs, the heavy sole of my boot inches away from her designer hem. The priest looked at my father, then at the groom, his hands trembling over his Bible. Shall we continue?" Liam stepped forward, his eyes never leaving mine. "Yes," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "Let's get to the part where we all tell the truth. I'm Zelda Vance, 29, and I own a premier forensic restoration firm that handles the biohazardous aftermath of tragedies most people only see in nightmares. I stepped into the line of bridesmaids at the front of the cathedral, my steel-toed boots sounding like gunshots against the polished white marble. I took my place at the very end of the row, a jagged piece of industrial obsidian in a sea of soft, shimmering periwinkle silk. The other bridesmaids, Bianca's socialite friends who had never worked a day in their lives, visibly recoiled as I approached. Their silk skirts hissed as they shuffled away from me, a sound like a nest of disturbed vipers. I didn't care. I felt the sweat from my 14-hour shift cooling against my skin, turning the thick navy cotton of my utility jumpsuit into a damp, heavy shroud. Bianca stood at the center of the altar, a vision in 300 yards of hand-stitched Belgian lace. She looked like a doll carved from expensive ice. As I settled into my spot, she turned her head just a fraction of an inch. Her veil, which probably cost more than my first 2 cleanup vans, shimmered under the grand chandelier. She didn't look at my face. She looked at the Sterling Restorations logo embroidered in white thread across my chest. She looked at it as if it were a contagious rash. She leaned toward me, her movement graceful and calculated. Her perfume, something floral and obscenely expensive, clashed violently with the sharp, clinical scent of hospital-grade disinfectant and the metallic ghost of copper that clung to my skin despite my best efforts. "You're pathetic, Zelda," she hissed. Her voice was a razor blade wrapped in velvet, intended only for my ears. "You smell like a hospital ward and a rotting basement. You should have stayed in the dark where you belong. You're a stain on this family that even you can't scrub out." I felt my heart hammer against my ribs, a frantic, rhythmic thud that made the air in my lungs feel thin. I didn't flinch. I didn't look away. I watched the way her nostrils flared in disgust, the way her perfectly manicured hands trembled against her bouquet of white lilies. She was terrified of me. She was terrified that my presence would remind everyone in this room that the Vance family's perfect reputation was built on the secrets I spent my nights erasing for them. To my left, my father stood beside her, prepared to give her away. He didn't look at the groom. He didn't look at the priest. He stared sideways at me, his eyes burning with a hatred so pure it felt like a physical blow. His face was a mask of controlled, aristocratic rage, the skin pulled tight over his cheekbones until he looked like a corpse. "I should have disowned you years ago," he muttered, his words barely audible over the soft, ambient hum of the cathedral's air conditioning. "You've ruined our reputation forever. You aren't my daughter, you're just a janitor who doesn't know her place. Look at you, you look like trash." I felt the words hit my chest, cold and heavy. I looked down at my boots, which were still stained with the dust of a tragedy I had spent 12 hours cleaning up so he wouldn't have to face a lawsuit. I was the one who protected him. I was the one who did the dirty work that kept his hands clean. And here he was, treating me like the debris I hauled to the incinerator. The side of my face burned under his gaze, but I kept my chin up. I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing me break. The priest cleared his throat, the sound echoing through the cavernous, vaulted space. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and genuine fear, then looked back at his Bible. He began the liturgy, his voice a low drone that felt miles away. I stood there, my muscles locking into place, my jaw aching from how hard I was clenching my teeth. Every breath I took felt like I was inhaling glass. "If any person here present," the priest intoned, his voice rising to fill the silence of the 500 guests, "knows of any reason or just impediment why these two should not be joined in holy wedlock, let them speak now or forever hold their peace." The silence that followed was a physical weight. It pressed down on my shoulders, making it hard to stand straight. It was a vacuum sucking the air out of the room. I could hear my own pulse drumming in my ears, a frantic, driving beat. I looked at Liam. He was standing perfectly still, his tuxedo fitting his broad shoulders with military precision. He wasn't looking at Bianca. He wasn't looking at the priest. He was looking at me. His eyes were dark, unreadable, and fixed on mine with an intensity that made my skin prickle. He didn't look horrified. He didn't look disgusted. He looked like a man who was watching a fuse burn down to the powder keg. I felt the folded note in my pocket, the jagged piece of notebook paper with his hurried handwriting. Wait for the speech. The silence stretched. 1 second, 2, 5. A woman in the third row let out a nervous, stifled cough that sounded like a gunshot in the stillness. My mother, sitting in the front row, let out a shaky, jagged breath that sounded like she was on the verge of a breakdown. The tension in the room was a piano wire stretched to the snapping point. I wanted to scream. I wanted to rip the lace from the walls and tell every person in this room exactly what I had been doing at 4 in the morning while they slept in their silk sheets. I wanted to tell them about the blood I'd scrubbed from the floor of the guest house my father tried to hide. I wanted to tell them that I was the only thing standing between them and the truth. But I didn't move. I stayed silent. I was a forensic specialist. I knew how to wait for the evidence to surface. I knew that the biggest messes aren't cleaned with bleach, they're cleaned with the truth. And as the priest closed his book to continue the vows, I knew the real cleanup hadn't even started yet. I'm Zelda Vance, 29, and I have spent the last decade scrubbing the literal and metaphorical blood off the hands of the wealthy elite who think they are too clean to touch the earth. I stood at the end of the bridal lineup, a jagged, oil-stained shadow in a row of pastel silk. My sister Bianca was radiating a triumphant, cold heat. She thought she had won. She thought that by parading me in front of her high society guests in my work-stained jumpsuit, she had finally cemented my status as the family's resident failure. My mother sat in the front row, her spine as rigid as a frozen pike, her eyes refusing to acknowledge my existence even though I was less than 5 feet away. My father's face was a mask of practiced, aristocratic boredom. They were waiting for the moment to be over so they could go back to pretending I was a ghost. The priest stepped back, his duty done for the moment. "We will now hear the vows," he whispered, his voice trembling. Bianca turned toward Liam, a practiced, sugary smile stretching across her face. She reached out her gloved hands, expecting him to take them. She was ready for her moment in the spotlight. She was ready for the world to see the union of two of the most powerful families in the state. Liam didn't move. He didn't reach for her hands. He didn't look into her eyes. He didn't even acknowledge the way she tilted her head in confusion. Instead, his hand went to the microphone stand. I heard the sharp, metallic clink of the mic being pulled from its cradle. The sound echoed through the vaulted ceiling of the cathedral like a gavel hitting a block. Liam didn't look at his bride. He slowly, deliberately turned his back on her. He faced the front row. He faced my parents. The air in the church didn't just go still, it turned ice cold. I felt the hair on my arms stand up. I could smell the sharp, citrusy sting of my own industrial soap mixing with the heavy, cloying scent of the thousands of white roses. My heart was a bird trapped in a cage, fluttering wildly against my ribs. "I had a speech prepared," Liam began. His voice was different. It wasn't the polite, polished tone he used at charity galas. It was deep, resonant, and carried a jagged edge that sliced through the silence of the room. "I spent weeks writing about legacy. I spent weeks writing about the joining of two houses. My mother's face transformed. A small, smug smile touched her lips. She leaned forward slightly, her pearls catching the light. I knew exactly what she was thinking. She thought he was about to praise her. She thought he was about to thank her for the discipline and high standards she had used to mold her daughters into accessories for his life. She looked at him with the pride of a woman who had successfully closed a business deal. But over the last 6 months, Liam continued, his eyes locking onto my father's, I stopped writing, I started watching. The smile on my mother's face didn't vanish, it froze. It became a brittle porcelain mask. My father's eyes narrowed, his brows drawing together in a sharp V. I've spent half a year inside your home, Liam said. He stepped closer to the edge of the altar, the microphone gripped in a white-knuckled fist. I've sat at your table. I've listened to your conversations. And I have never in my life seen such calculated, systematic cruelty masquerading as class. A collective gasp rippled through the pews. It was a physical wave of sound, 100 intakes of breath that made the candles on the altar flicker. Bianca made a small, choked sound in the back of her throat, a wounded animal noise, but Liam didn't even glance her way. I felt a bead of sweat roll down the back of my neck. My knees felt weak, but I forced myself to stand tall. I looked at Liam's profile. His jaw was set like granite. He looked like an executioner. I watched you treat your youngest daughter like a stray dog, Liam said, his voice rising, filling every corner of the cathedral. I watched you mock her for the work she does, work that is more honest and more grueling than anything any of you has ever touched. I watched you try to break her spirit because she chose to face the reality of the world instead of hiding behind your silk curtains. My mother's face went from pale to a blotchy, angry red. She looked like she was choking. She looked toward the guests, her eyes darting frantically, searching for a way to stop the bleeding. My father started to stand, his face contorted in a snarl of "How dare you?" But Liam didn't stop. "You call it discipline," Liam spat, the word sounding like a curse. "You call it maintaining an image. I call it a sickness. You've spent Zelda's entire life trying to make her feel small so that you could feel tall. You've treated her like a stain on your reputation when the truth is she's the only thing in this family that actually has a soul." I felt the sob before I heard it. It was a dry, racking heave in my chest that I had to swallow back. My vision blurred for a second. I looked at my boots, the steel toes reflecting the flickering candlelight. I felt the weight of every insult, every janitor joke, every time I had been forced to eat in the kitchen while they hosted dignitaries. It was all being dragged out into the light. "You thought you were bringing me into your fold," Liam said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "You thought I was one of you. You thought I shared your contempt for anyone who gets their hands dirty." He finally turned. He didn't look at Bianca. He looked directly at me. The intensity of his gaze was like a physical heat. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like the girl in the dirty jumpsuit. I didn't feel like the disappointment. I felt seen. I felt like the most important person in the room. "You were wrong," Liam said, turning back to my parents. "I don't want your legacy, and I certainly don't want your daughter." The silence that followed wasn't just quiet, it was the sound of a world ending. I watched as my mother's hand went to her throat, her fingers fumbling with her pearls until the string snapped. The white beads hit the marble floor, bouncing and scattering like tiny, expensive hailstones. Clack, clack, clack. Bianca finally spoke, her voice a shrill, hysterical scream. "Liam, what are you doing? Stop this, look at me." Liam didn't look at her. He set the microphone back on the stand with a finality that echoed like a door slamming shut. He stepped down from the altar, his eyes never leaving mine as he walked toward the row where I stood. He moved with a purpose that made the guests in the front row shrink back. He reached the end of the line. He stopped right in front of me. I could smell his cologne, sandalwood, and rain, and for the first time today, it didn't clash with the smell of the chemicals on my skin. It felt like an anchor. "Zelda," he said, his voice for my ears only. "Let's get out of here. You have a real job to do, and I'm done playing house with monsters." I looked at my parents. My mother was weeping silently, her face buried in her hands. My father looked like he had aged 20 years in 3 minutes. Bianca was a heap of lace on the floor, her bridesmaids hovering over her like useless birds. I didn't say a word to them. I didn't need to. The truth was out, and no amount of scrubbing was ever going to make this family look clean again. I reached out and took Liam's hand. My calloused, scarred palm pressed against his smooth skin. I felt the strength in his grip, the solid reality of him. "I have my van out front," I said, my voice steady for the first time all day. "But you might get some grease on that suit." Liam smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "I think I've been clean for far too long." We turned our backs on the altar, on the roses, and on the wreckage of the Vance reputation. As we walked down the long, silk-lined aisle, the only sound was the rhythmic, heavy thud of my work boots against the marble, leading the way out. "I'm Zelda Vance, 32, and I am the highest-paid biohazard restoration specialist on the East Coast. The woman people call when they need the impossible erased from existence." I felt the heavy, grease-stained fabric of my work jumpsuit suddenly feel lighter, as if the shame my mother had tried to weave into the threads was evaporating under the heat of Liam's gaze. He didn't just stand there. He took a step back toward the microphone, his eyes sweeping over the rows of stunned socialites, the silent investors, and the horrified faces of my family. He wasn't done. He hadn't just broken the engagement, he was about to rebuild the world's perception of me from the ashes of their elitism. "You all see a girl in a dirty uniform," Liam's voice boomed, vibrating through the soles of my boots. "You see someone you think is beneath you because she works with her hands. You think she's the failure of the Vance family." I watched my mother's hands tremble as she tried to gather the broken pearls from the floor. She looked small. For the first time in my life, she looked pathetic. "3 years ago," Liam continued, his voice dropping into a register of pure steel, "an anonymous investor put $4 million into a startup called Sterling Restorations. You've all heard of them. They're the firm the city calls when a skyscraper has a chemical leak. They're the firm the government calls when a site is too dangerous for anyone else to touch." A low murmur rippled through the pews. I saw my father's head snap up. He knew that name. Every developer in the state knew Sterling Restorations. They were the ghosts of the industry, the elite cleaners who made problems vanish. "I was that investor," Liam said. He turned to me, a fierce pride burning in his eyes that made my breath hitch. "But I didn't build that company. Zelda did. I am the silent partner, but Zelda is the genius, the grit, and the soul of that entire operation. She isn't just a cleaner. She is the highest paid specialist in this industry and my most valued business asset." The air left the room. I felt the shift in the atmosphere like a physical pressure change. The looks of pity from the bridesmaids curdled into something sharp and envious. Bianca's jaw literally dropped, her mouth a perfect, horrified O against her pale skin. She had spent all morning laughing at my janitor status, and now she was learning that her fiancé was my junior business partner. "But more than that," Liam said, his voice softening but losing none of its edge. "Zelda is a hero. 2 years ago, when my brother Julian was trapped in that lab explosion, when the fire department couldn't get in because of the toxins and the structural damage. It wasn't a socialite who went in. It wasn't a woman in a silk dress. He looked directly at my parents. It was Zelda. She put on her gear, she ignored the risk to her own life, and she dragged my brother out of the wreckage. She performed a cleanup that required more bravery than anyone in this room possesses. She saved my family while her own was busy trying to figure out how to hide her from their Christmas cards. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I stood taller. I felt the grease on my face not as a mark of filth, but as a badge of honor. I looked at Bianca, whose face was now a sickly shade of gray. She had spent her life being a decorative object, while I had been out in the world, saving people, building an empire, and earning the respect of the man she thought she had captured. The Vances think they are too clean to touch the earth, Liam spat, turning back to the crowd. But the only thing dirty in this cathedral is the way you treat your own blood. Zelda is the only person here with any real value. And as of this moment, my firm is severing all ties with Vance Holdings. The gasp that followed was deafening. That was the death knell. My father's empire was built on Liam's family's capital. Without them, the Vances were just people with expensive clothes and empty bank accounts. I looked at my mother. A single tear tracked through her heavy foundation, leaving a jagged line. She looked at me, really looked at me for the first time in a decade. I saw the realization hit her. She had discarded the only child who could have actually saved them. I didn't feel pity. I felt a cold, crystalline sense of freedom. Liam stepped down from the dais and walked back to me. He didn't care about the cameras. He didn't care about the ruined ceremony. He reached out and took my hand again, his fingers interlacing with mine. "Ready?" he whispered. I looked at my sister, sobbing in her heap of expensive lace. I looked at the high society guests who were already whispering and reaching for their phones to tweet the scandal. The power dynamic had shifted in a single breathless heartbeat. I wasn't the girl in the jumpsuit anymore. I was the woman who held their future in my calloused hands. "I have a job at 5, I said, my voice clear and resonant, echoing off the stained glass. "A chemical spill at the docks. It's messy, it's dangerous, and the pay is more than this entire wedding cost." Liam grinned. It was a dangerous, beautiful look. "Lead the way, boss." I turned my back on the altar. I didn't look back at the wreckage. I walked down the aisle, the heavy thud clack of my work boots drowning out the sound of Bianca's hysterical cries. I felt the eyes of every person in that church on my back, not with mockery, but with a sudden, terrified respect. I pushed open the heavy oak doors of the cathedral. The sunlight hit me, blinding and warm. I took a deep breath of the outside air, tasting the salt and the exhaust of the city. It smelled like work. It smelled like reality. It smelled like the life I had built for myself, far away from the polished lies of the Vance name. I was Zelda Vance. I cleaned up the world's messes. And today I had finally finished cleaning up my own. I'm Zelda Vance, 32, and I've spent the last decade scrubbing the literal stains of death and chemical decay out of rooms that would make a seasoned detective vomit. Liam stood at the altar, his posture as rigid as the stone pillars surrounding us. He didn't look like a groom anymore. He looked like an executioner. He turned his gaze slowly toward my father, whose face was rapidly draining of color. "You call these work rags?" Liam's voice roared, the sound vibrating through the soles of my heavy work boots. He pointed a trembling finger at the grease-stained sleeves of my jumpsuit. "Every thread of silk in this cathedral, every drop of vintage champagne waiting in the foyer, every single petal of those $5,000 lilies was paid for by the sweat on those rags." The room went deathly silent. I could hear the frantic ticking of the clock at the back of the hall. My father's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked like a fish gasping for air. "You think Zelda is the embarrassment of this family?" Liam continued, his eyes flashing with a cold, terrifying fire. "The only reason you even have a roof over your heads is because of her. I've been the one intercepting the bank foreclosure notices for the last 6 months. I've seen the red ink. I've seen the 3 mortgages you took out on the estate just to keep up the appearance of being the Vances." A low, collective gasp rippled through the pews. I watched the socialites in the front row, women who had spent the morning whispering about my stench, physically recoil. They pulled their expensive skirts away from my parents as if bankruptcy were a contagious disease. The rustle of their silk sounded like dry leaves in a graveyard. My mother let out a sound I will never forget. It was a high, thin wail that broke into a ragged sob. She collapsed into the velvet-cushioned pew, her face buried in her perfectly manicured hands. The sound of her weeping bounced off the high, vaulted ceilings, hollow and ugly. It was the sound of a world ending. "You're bankrupt," Liam said, his voice dropping into a register of pure steel. "You're frauds. And yet you had the audacity to stand here and mock the woman who has been quietly keeping your lives from falling apart. You treated a hero like a servant because she wasn't clean enough for your fake reality." I felt a strange, electric heat radiating from my chest. My heart hammered against my ribs, a rhythmic drum of pure, unadulterated justice. I looked at my sister, Bianca. She was frozen, her hand still clutching the pearls that had already snapped and scattered. She looked small, she looked cheap. Liam reached into his pocket. He pulled out the platinum wedding band, a circle of diamonds that was supposed to bind him to my sister forever. He held it up for a moment. The light from the stained glass hit the stones, sending jagged shards of light across the room. "I cannot marry into a family that lacks a basic soul," Liam said. He looked directly at Bianca, but there was no love left in his eyes. There wasn't even anger, there was only disgust. "I will not bankroll your cruelty for another second." He opened his hand. The ring fell. It hit the marble floor with a sharp, metallic clink. The sound was tiny, but in that silent cathedral it felt louder than a gunshot. The ring bounced once, twice, and then rolled a few inches before settling in a crack in the floor. Clink, clink, silence. Liam stepped down from the dais. He didn't look back at the priest. He didn't look at the wreckage of the Vance reputation. He walked straight toward me. The guests parted like the Red Sea, their eyes wide with a mix of horror and sudden, terrified respect. He reached me and didn't hesitate. He took my hand, my rough, calloused, chemical-scented hand, and laced his fingers through mine. His skin was warm, mine was shaking. "Let's go, Zelda," he whispered, though his voice carried to the very back of the room. "We have actual work to do. This place is beyond cleaning." I turned my back on my parents. I didn't look at my mother's crumpled form or my father's shattered expression. I didn't look at the high society vultures who were already reaching for their phones to tweet the downfall of the Vance empire. I took a step forward. The heavy thud of my work boots against the marble drowned out the sound of my mother's sobbing. I felt the weight of the jumpsuit, but for the first time it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like armor. As we walked down the long, silk-lined aisle toward the heavy oak doors, I felt the air change. The scent of the lilies faded, replaced by the sharp, clean smell of the city outside. I was Zelda Vance, the woman who cleaned up the world's most dangerous messes. And today I had finally finished the biggest cleanup of my life. I'm Zelda Vance, 32, and I've spent more time in the aftermath of tragedies than I have in the comfort of my own home. Liam descended the final marble step. He stood directly in front of me. He didn't see the grease on my forehead or the chemical scent clinging to my hair. He saw me. He offered his arm, his elbow bent at a perfect, chivalrous angle. A genuine, private smile touched his lips. I hesitated for a fraction of a second. My hand was a map of scars and permanent stains from a decade of scrubbing. His sleeve was a masterpiece of charcoal wool, expensive and pristine. I reached out. I let my calloused fingers rest against the softness of his suit. The contrast was jarring. It was the most honest thing in this entire cathedral. "Shall we?" he asked. His voice was a calm anchor in the middle of the storm he had just created. I nodded. We turned toward the back of the church. I didn't rush. I wanted every person in these pews to feel the weight of my boots on the floor. The thud clack echoed off the stone walls like a countdown. I passed Bianca. She was a heap of white lace and ruined mascara on the floor. She looked like a discarded doll. Her breath came in jagged, ugly hiccups that smelled of expensive gin and desperation. I felt nothing but a cold, distant clarity. My father tried to reach out. His hand trembled in the air. His eyes were wide, pleading for a miracle I would never give him. He wanted me to save the Vance name one last time. I looked through him as if he were made of glass. I didn't even break my stride. My mother was still wailing. The sound was high-pitched and thin. It was the sound of a woman realizing her jewelry was fake and her status was gone. The socialites who had snickered at my jumpsuit were now statue still. They stared at their laps. They adjusted their fascinators with frantic, nervous fingers. They refused to meet my gaze. The power had shifted so violently that the air felt thin. They knew the hierarchy had collapsed. They knew I was the one walking out with the man, the truth, and the future. The heavy oak doors loomed ahead, framed by the bright gold of the afternoon. Liam squeezed my hand against his side. I could feel the steady beat of his heart through his jacket. We stepped through the threshold. The sun hit me like a physical blow. It was blinding, it was hot, it was perfect. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the gritty, honest air of the city. The scent of lilies and incense was gone. In its place was the smell of asphalt, salt, and potential. For 32 years, I had tried to wash away the dirt my family saw in me. I had scrubbed until my knuckles bled, trying to be worthy of their polished world. I realized now that I was the only one in that room who had ever been clean. The grime on my skin was just work. The grime on their souls was permanent. I am never going back to that house. I am never scrubbing another floor for people who wouldn't even hold the bucket. Liam opened the door to his car, but I looked toward the docks. The smoke from the industrial district was rising in the distance. There was a mess waiting for me. There were lives to protect and spills to contain. I am Zelda Vance. I am a cleaner, and today I am finally free.